webinar series together with Adelphi as part of the Berlin Climate Security Conference in partnership with Adelphi. Our common thread throughout the course of this webinar series will be sustaining peace as an integrated lens of analysis for our discussions on the impacts of climate-related security risk on peace and security. With the Sustaining Peace agenda, the Secretary General has placed conflict prevention at the top of his priorities, recognizing that conflict is fueled by a variety of overlapping factors, including climate change. While there is no direct causal link between climate change and conflicts, there is growing evidence that climate-related risks could exacerbate conflict dynamics, converging with other shocks and pressures to threaten stability of states and societies. Climate change impacts inhibit peace by undermining human security and increasing the impact of conflict and fragility. This is why it is essential that sustaining peace interventions start from a comprehensive analysis of climate-related risks and adopt an integrated framework, integrating adaptation and peace-building approaches into climate-sensitive decision-making and programming. The aim of this session is to discuss how the links between migration, displacement, climate change, and conflicts, with the view of highlighting and calling for sustainable responses to address the needs of migrants, refugees, and local communities. While there is a general narrative that present migration as a security threat, in our webinar today, we will focus on understanding how mobility can be a product of climate change, but the way this will play out with security implications or not is the result of an interaction of socioeconomic factors, governance factors, political factors that are context specific and need to be addressed in an integrated way. I have the pleasure to be joined today by Mr. Harper, UNHCR Special Advisor on Climate Change, Dr. Beatrice Mosello, Senior Analyst at Adelphi and Senior Fellow, non-resident at the United Nations University Center for Peace and Policy Research, and Dr. Majd Naber, Team Leader and Senior Researcher, Sustainable Development, West Asia, North Africa Institute. So I will now leave the floor to Andrew to take us through some of the questions and answer in order to identify sustainable responses to migrations and adaptation. So Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organizers, whether it be the United Nations University, Adelphi, the German government, UNEP, because the discussion that we're having today probably couldn't have been held 2 years ago, or certainly not held in the manner which it can be today. We're just coming out of we're just at the end of the UNGA session. We had the Security Council discussions on climate security last week. We're now moving in towards COP26. And if you go back to Madrid 2 years ago, climate, human mobility, forced displacement wasn't even really on the agenda. We had to try and raise it at every possible opportunity. But just within the last 2 years, things have changed so radically that it is now very much a core element in discussing the impact of climate change. And as was just discussed, we cannot see and we should not see people moving as a security threat. People do not want to move if they've got a better option. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have got as a community is to provide people with the options. And as was also just raised then, and like basically a lot of my presentations has just been addressed, is that it's not just an issue of climate change, it's also an issue of what are the other mega trends that are taking place in the world and how the climate is exacerbating those trends. We are seeing that competition over resources, food insecurity, challenges of access to water, challenges towards governance, they are playing out, they are leading to conflict, they are leading to violence, and they are leading to displacement. We, as within UNHCR, are supporting a major study in the Sahel region in support of the United Nations integrated strategy for the Sahel, where we are working with probably a dozen centers of excellence, including Adelphi, and this is being supported by the German Federal Office, so thank you very much for that, but also with Columbia and Uppsala and Reading Institute and Potsdam, because we all understand that we need to be working together in order to have that integrated understanding. No agency and no think tank or center of excellence have got the answers. And even after we do the research and after we bring all the best brains together, we still won't have the answers. But what we want to do is raise the ambition of the discussion that is required to take place to understand the future. We need to be looking at various scenarios, because at the moment, the scenarios which are looking towards a 1.5 degree limit to warming are becoming increasingly impractical. Like even the latest news coming out this morning is that the commitments by governments towards keeping it to 1.5 degrees is largely unattainable. So we have got an obligation and a responsibility not only to be thinking positively, but also to be preparing for the worst. And we've also got a responsibility, even though we are a humanitarian agency, not just to react or wait for people to cross the border in order to provide protection. The science is clear, the data is clear, we just haven't been listening it for decades. And so what we now need to be doing is listening to those people who have been advising of what the challenges are and what they will be in the future in order that we can be better informed. On the positive side, there is a lot of data out there. On the negative side, it hasn't been used. It's still very much owned in a way which does not promote sharing or transparency. It's not collected in a way which is strategic or which is looking towards ensuring a common outcome. And so as a consequence, there is a lot of agencies doing a lot of work leading to very little. This has to change, and it has to change now. We need to be relying on evidence in which to drive the decision making. We need to be looking at ensuring that data is collected in a way which addresses the needs of the populations on the ground, not just the needs of Western capitals. We need to ensure that data and evidence is used for programming, not just for 12 months, but looking how can programs be best put in place to address the needs in 5 to 10 years' time. And we need to ensure that the projects and activities that are being put in place are not short-term, but they're geared up to be addressing the challenges that the world will be faced with in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. It's not going to be easy, but we need to be doing a better job than what we are doing now. It gives me a lot of confidence that through this Sahel project, again, we've been working with Adelphi and Potsdam Institute and Uppsala and Columbia and a whole host of others, that there's such a willingness. And this is where we don't necessarily see in a lot of arrangements, but there's such a sense of collaboration between those entities to make a difference. So we've just got to be working much harder in doing that. What we have found when we've been looking at the data for the Sahel is that sometimes not only is it seen as a proprietary asset by some agencies, so it's a little bit difficult to access, but there's very limited time series data, particularly at the subnational level. So we need to be much more engaged in trying to ensure that we can collect that in order to address some of these common outcomes. You might ask also, like, why is UNHCR so much engaged in climate and anticipatory planning and looking about how we can anticipate things? Well, it's simple. We can't continue the way which we've been working. We're seeing increasing numbers of people being displaced and increased numbers of people in need. So what we're looking to do is to see, is there a causal relationship, a direct relationship, indirect relationship between climate change? And what we are seeing is that there is. That the statistics that we've been collecting over the last years already indicates that 90% of the world's refugees originate from countries which have been most impacted by climate change and least adaptable, or least prepared to adapt to the changes that are coming forth. So if we expect that climate change is going to disrupt food security, access to water, challenge governance, possibly turn fragile states into failed states, then yes, we will expect a significant increase in the numbers of people who are being made vulnerable. And that could lead to conflict, and that will lead to people moving. You just have to look at the number of people last year who were made food insecure. And I'll wrap it up now. But there was 100 million people added to the people who were, the 700 million people who were food insecure before. So these are the numbers that we have to start preparing for. We hope that the situation does not become as bad as what some anticipate, but it's really up to us. We cannot just keep our heads in the sand, ignore the science, ignore the scenarios and say it's all going to be okay and we can put up a wall around us. That's just not going to work. People will not move if there's no other choice, or they will move if there's no other choice. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this very sharp presentation. And while Andrew's presentation focused very much on addressing the questions, the linkages between climate change and migration and movements and human mobility, I want to give the floor to Beatrice Mosello, who has been studying, basically been focusing on Bangladesh and Central Asia to look at mobility in the face of global challenges, looking at whether the narrative of that there would be a causal link between migration and security holds true or not, and what other factors might be interacting with that. And in addition to that, the report provides some interesting recommendations that the international community can take forward. So with that, I leave the floor to Beatrice Mosello. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Great, thank you very much, Ginevra, and thank you to all of you for being with us today, indeed, and attending this panel, the first one of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference 2021. Let me start maybe with a reflection, and that is that essentially when we think about migration, displacement, climate change and conflict, what we need to do is to change the narrative, to rethink the narrative that we currently have. As Andrew was saying before, there's been a lot of talking, especially over the past 5 years, around migration and displacement in general and how climate change will make it all worse. And these discussions, this research that backs them is essential to draw our attention to the impacts of climate change and to call for mitigation and adaptation actions to deal with them. But we need to be careful about not feeding those narratives that depict migration as a threat to our societies. So by not relying on these kind of general narratives, climate change equals more migration and displacement equals insecurity, because these narratives, by being general, risk missing the complexity and context specificity of the links between climate change, migration, displacement, and conflict. And if you miss those links, you'll miss the chance of coming up with effective responses that address the needs of migrants, but also of their home and destination communities. So we need essentially to move towards a new narrative that is informed and shaped by a strong understanding of the context-specific interactions between biophysical climate impacts, mobility, and insecurity, very much to Andrew's point before. B, moves away from the threat discourse and focuses instead on the ways in which mobility can serve as an adaptive strategy to climate and conflict-related risks and vulnerability. And C, very importantly, places diversity at the center stage, taking into account the position of individuals, of groups in society, and the opportunities they have. But let's maybe take a step back and think together about the evidence that underpins this narrative. And I'm using here, as Ginevra was mentioning, some findings of our latest report on the topic, which is called Rethinking Human Mobility in the Face of Global Changes, focusing on the cases of Bangladesh and Central Asia. And I see that my colleague has already posted a link in the chat. Thank you so much. So our starting point there, and in general, I think, should be that migration and displacement will indeed be aggravated by climate change. The latest Brownsville report published by the World Bank found this, confirmed this. Andrew was just mentioning some numbers there before confirming this. And this link will happen both directly and through the compounding effects that climate change has on poverty, unemployment, conflict, which we know are already driving mobility worldwide. So looking at the case studies that we took, we analyzed in our report, for example, if we look at Bangladesh, we know that historically the country has been prone to natural disasters such as cyclones, floods, landslides, and that mobility has traditionally been a coping strategy to deal with the impacts of extreme weather events. And this has happened for decades. But what we're seeing today is that especially internal migration trends have increased significantly, also to cope with the slow onset climate change impacts such as sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, and rising temperatures. Looking at the more kind of compounding effects of climate change, Central Asia is a good example there. Migration mobility has traditionally that have been associated with economic causes. But what we're seeing today is that environmental degradation and climate change impact, especially on the agricultural sector, that remains the sector that employs most people in the Central Asian countries, up to, for example, 53% in Tajikistan, are indeed playing a larger role in shaping mobility decisions than it used to be the case before. So actually, economic factors remain the main cause, but we're seeing that these have been kind of exacerbated, compounded by climate impacts. And as I was mentioning in my introduction, it's very important that we understand how these links play out depending on the type of climate impact, but very importantly also the socioeconomic, the political, and other dynamics that are at play in specific contexts. But not only that, it's very important that we understand how they will play out differently for different demographic and social groups. For example, let's take gender as an analytical lens here. And in Bangladesh, women are slightly more likely than men to migrate to cities, so internal migration, most of them working in the garment industry, so concentrated in Dhaka and Chittagong. Instead, if we look at cross-border migration for Bangladesh, that has been historically dominated by men. Although in the last decade or so, we're also seeing more women leaving the country, largely to be engaged in domestic work in countries like Jordan and Lebanon, with very high associated risks, for example, of being trafficked for prostitution. Instead, if we look at Central Asia, although of course with slight differences between countries, migration remains a predominantly male phenomenon. So it's largely men that leave, largely it's about cross-regional migration, so to other countries within the region, say Kazakhstan and Russia. Women stay at home, but this makes them dependent on remittances that are sent by their husbands, by their partners, by their brothers. So if the money stops coming in, and this often happens, they face economic hardships at the same time in which they take on additional caring roles, for example, for the children and the elderly in the family. So they're even more exposed and they're even more vulnerable, having higher economic needs. In some contexts, this dynamic of moving because of directly or indirectly climate change, when they're not understood, when they're not managed properly, they can have also security implications. And here we get to our security linkage here. So for example, internal migration can lead to overcrowding in cities that are receiving more people than they can accommodating. And Dhaka in Bangladesh is a very good example of this. More people means lack of basic services, means high rates of unemployment, especially among the youth, which can lead to increased rates of criminality and even political instability. If we look at migration to neighboring countries, when this increases and when the relationships between countries are already tense, so there are already issues there, migration can put additional strain, and this has been, for example, the case between Bangladesh and India, or it can worsen tensions over access to resources. And we had just a few months ago cases of armed disputes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan over the border over access to water resources. But again, it's important that these linkages between climate change, mobility, and security are not casted in absolute terms. Migration is dangerous narrative. Indeed, actually, maybe the most important takeaway from our analysis is the exact contrary. It's actually that mobility under the right circumstances can be an important and effective adaptation strategy. But in order to do so, it needs to be accompanied by adequate investments in sustainable infrastructure, basic services, social protection, economic opportunities, both for those who live and for those who remain. So I talked a bit at the beginning about the need to change the narrative, and I said how the narrative should change, but what do we need to get there? And we think there are 5 priority areas for action that will help shape a more positive and helpful narrative around human mobility and climate change. Firstly, as Andrew was highlighting in his intervention, we need more knowledge, we need more evidence, awareness of climate-induced mobility, which can be done with policy-relevant research that looks and understands the complex dynamics behind human mobility in connection to climate change, backed by the collection of data that need to be, at the very least, sex and age disaggregated. There's also a very important role to play for governments in origin, transit, and receiving countries, as well as their international partners, so development donors, organizations, humanitarian organizations, to focus on promoting adaptation, development, prioritizing investments in service provision, infrastructure, especially in urban areas and especially in second-tier cities, so that they can become a viable alternative to larger cities. While at the same time, we need policy at local, national, regional, and international level that support also rural development, land access, land tenure. We need to look more at nature-based solutions to protect against climate-based risks, that while also providing livelihoods, land restoration, mangrove protection projects. Of course, focus should be put on financing responses to climate-induced migration and development. There are already some international mechanisms to this end that need to be supported. The IOM's Development Fund is one, the Green Climate Fund, but also strengthening the role of the private sector. For example, I haven't touched upon this, but encouraging competition to lower the cost of services such as remittance sending. And we know that remittances play a key role in the link between migration and development. And finally, we need strong global action and cooperation on climate-induced mobility. On one side, of course, to facilitate the negotiation of bilateral sub-regional agreements for freedom of movement and access to the labor market, ensuring policy coherence between sectors and organizations so that we avoid those inconsistencies that can make some policies harmful. But I would say when we talk about global action, we really need, and particularly important to say it here, a few weeks ahead of COP26, we really need strong action to drive mitigation efforts so that the worst impacts of climate change can be avoided. And I'll stop here, looking forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for this important contribution, and also for providing some recommendations at all levels, from the local to the international level, for possible way forward when it comes to finding sustainable solution. And now we've just talked about Bangladesh, Central Asia. We will now move to another part of the world, the MENA region, with Dr. Majd Naber from the WANA Institute, who's been looking at some of the relationships between water shocks, climate change, security, and human mobility. So Majd, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me today. So as I said, today I will highlight the impact of climate change on migration in MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. I will start by providing some information related to water resource management in our region, then link it with the climate change, trying to answer the linkage between water shocks that caused by climate change and migration, and then if there is a link between water shocks and conflict in the region. But I would like to highlight that some of the information that I will be providing and mentioning is based on a background report prepared by WANA to the World Bank as a part of their recent report, Ebb and Flow Volume 2. So let's start with the Middle East. It's well known that MENA region has captured many of issues surrounding water and migration. It's very well known that water availability and accessibility are essential factors to achieve and sustain any country's development. Our region is the most water scarce in the world, with more than 70% of its population living in an area with high water stress. The global water withdrawal have more than doubled since the 16th without any sign of slowing down. The situation is becoming worse and worse when we move forward, and there isn't, to be honest, there isn't like a bright future for water resources in the MENA region, and this is accelerated by the climate change. Worldwide, there are 70 countries that are suffering from extremely high water stress. 12 out of these 17 are located in MENA region, and unfortunately, 5 out of 12 are located in the Levant. Jordan is considered one of the most water stressed countries based on the water stress index. It's followed by Libya and Algeria if you are talking about MENA, not Levant. So the availability and accessibility of water resources is normally associated with population growth, accelerated demand, food insecurity, insufficient management of natural resources, disaster associated with climate change. Nonetheless, the region is characterized by socioeconomic and political fragmentation and high unemployment rates. Since the 18th, the effect of climate change has been obvious. Drought, earthquakes, floods and storms occurrence have increased dramatically. Regarding migration, historically, the region has also experienced high level of both types of migration, interstate and intrastate. And recently, the level of forced displacement has been increased. In 2020, there were an estimate of 7.6 million refugees and asylum seekers, of whom about 2.7 million were hosted in the region, and 12.4 million internally displaced person IDPs. The region human mobility story can be divided in three main patterns in MENA. First of all, the forced displacement. It's normally happened due to war, political unrest, food security, natural disaster, and climate change. The second pattern is asylum seeker, while the third pattern is labor migrant. Normally people migrate from the Levant to the Gulf in order to find better economic or job opportunities. But today I will focus on the first pattern, forced migrant due to environmental challenge as water shocks. So here I will define water shocks as occasion happens due to climate change as drought, flood, frost, and wildfire. Let me start by providing you some example of water shocks. Where did it occur in our region and its effect on the community? Starting with the example about Syria, before March 2011, Syria has always been known as a self-sufficient country, but since the beginning of 18th century, flocculation and precipitation events have been noticed and is associated with a frequent drought season, especially between the period 2006 and 2010. And the peak of this drought period occurred between 2007 and 2008. The average of precipitation drops by 50% from north to south Syria and Al-Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Hasaka, and Homs. So rain-fed agriculture shifted to groundwater-based agriculture that caused a deteriorating in water quality, decreasing in water table, and eventually it resulting in agriculture failure. Accordingly, 40,000 to 60,000 families were migrated to Elpo and Dar'a. Moreover, not only drought, there is also a flash flood that occurred in 2018 and 2019 in Al-Hol and Arisha camp, led to flee of around 72,000 individuals. For Iraq, the same happened in Iraq, the drought season that happened in all Levant area, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. But the first ones happened in 2007, 2009. It was located in the northern governorate of Iraq, while the one that happened in 2010 and 2011, it hit the southern governorate of Diqar, Misan, and Qadisiyah governorate. Accordingly, rural to urban migration occurred in Misan governorate due to water scarcity, and this has been characterized with poor water management and increased uncertainty. Around 6,800 families migrate due to several conditions, include loss of crops and livestock mortality. If we talk about, or if we look into Yemen, tropical storms happened in 2008 and 2010, led to 20,000 migrants, and in Lebanon, a flood in 2019 led to 41,000 IDPs. This is just an example to show you where the water shocks occurred in MENA region, but doesn't mean that I cover everything. It's just an example from several countries. So back to the question that I read in the beginning, is there a link between water shocks and human mobility? Based on the study conducted by the World Bank in 2010, more than 25% of the IDPs in Iraq cited water scarcity as the main reason for displacement, and also the main reason preventing them to return back to their place of origin. And in the follow-up survey in 2019, the IOM in Iraq identified 21,000 IDPs from the Southern to Central Governorate who were displaced due to drinking water issues caused by high salinity content and waterborne disease. Given Southern Iraq's ongoing water challenges, migration emerged as a key option for rural families to adapt to increased water scarcity and decline in water quality. Beyond water scarcity, access to basic water services, basic drinking water sanitation facilities, housing, energy education, and healthcare can consider as a pull factor among the IDPs in Iraq. In other countries as Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Syria, and Yemen shows that water-related factors are not a primary driver for human mobility in the region. Other factors related to job security and socioeconomic situation of the household are more important drives when it's compared to water scarcity. Based on a study conducted by WANA, as I mentioned before, key experts agreed that water factors such as crop failure and drought had affected migration in the region. However, they also ranked other factors such as war, unemployment, and corruption, as much as more influence drives to migration component to water-related issue. And when we asked them to rank these factors in terms of the most uncertainty about their influence on migration, the experts identified high temperature and the high risk of natural hazards as having the most uncertain influence on migration. But what about water shocks and conflict? Did water shocks cause conflict or the opposite? We found that conflict has caused significant damage to water infrastructure and services, as water and electricity infrastructure and services have been targeted in the conflict, but not the opposite. So war and conflict cause deterioration in water infrastructure, deterioration of dams, etc. And when evaluating conflict drivers, and their uncertainty, experts agreed that mistrust of government, external intervention, unemployment, and corruption are all influence drivers. Also, the expert related that climate-related water risk as drought are deemed to have little or no influence on conflict risk. So in conclusion, there are various interlinked factors stimulate the displacement in the region, and mainly the IDPs, the interstate migration. Water shocks are one of them that's caused by climate change, but that can't be considered as a direct one. Normally, it's associated with economic, political, social, and stability factors. So it's a huge equation with all parameters. Water can't be, or climate change can't be considered as a direct effect for migrants in the region, but there's a lot of aspects that contribute to stimulate people to migrate. But how we can adopt and mitigate, adding to all recommendation that was mentioned by my colleagues, I believe that we need to increase country resilience towards climate change through developing technologies and tools to predict the effect of climate change, increase the preparedness level and adaptive capacity through disaster management and risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Majd, for giving us these examples from the MENA region, and once again pointing us to the fact that there is no direct link between migration and conflict, but that in some instances that conflict can in fact have an impact on the deterioration of water resources, and therefore increase even further the risk for violence in a particular region. And with that, perhaps I would like to open the floor for any questions from participants. I would like to invite you to raise your virtual hand if you want to do so. It's on the reactions button on the top bottom of this Zoom page, or simply ask your questions in the chat box. I don't know if there is any brave participants that want to share their question with us. Perhaps while we are waiting for some questions, there is one question or a reflection from my side. Last year, during the last Berlin Climate Security Conference, we did discuss all of these issues of migration, also of water security. And I think there was a trend of the different coffee hours that climate change and the impact of climate change and the possible interaction with factors that could then lead to conflict could, of course, be challenging for international organizations, local communities, governments, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, open some opportunities for peace building, some opportunities to address some of the vulnerabilities. So I would like to ask all of the panelists, Andrew, Beatrice, and Majd, from your experience, Andrew working with UNHCR, Beatrice conducting research at the adelphi UNU, and Majd with the Runner Institute in the MENA region. What are the opportunities that you see in your field to basically address some of the vulnerabilities by addressing some of the key questions that Andrew was mentioning at the beginning, and being, of course, honest with the answers. I hope I asked my question clearly. Over to you, and then I invite participants from the floor to ask any questions they might have related to the field of work of any curiosity for our speakers. Thank you very much. Over to you. I don't know if any of the panelists want to react to that.
Okay, I'll give it a go. I think one of the probably most positive developments, like there's a lot of bad news out there, there's no doubt about that, and the scenarios are indicating it's going to get worse. But if you deal with the communities on the ground, and particularly, let's say, municipalities, mayors of cities, regional entities, they get it. They get it much more than probably a lot of the leaders that will be going to COP26. So it's not that the issues are not being discussed in a reasonable way. It's just they're not necessarily getting the profile which is required. If you look at the United Nations, it's generally a meeting of the heads of state, leaders of countries. But the people who actually have to deal with it on the ground are the leaders of communities and the mayors. And this is where the traction and the pragmatic solutions come from. And the other thing which we're also seeing is that when, for instance, the West continues to maintain a less than ambitious approach to reducing carbon emissions, the countries who are on the front line, and whether they be the small island developing states or a number of countries in Latin America or in Africa, they are demonstrating real leadership. They are demonstrating leadership in a way that they understand that they've got a regional responsibility to provide protection to people who would otherwise fall through the cracks under international, let's say, refugee law, under international humanitarian law. So the development of regional protection mechanisms is probably something which we have got a great deal of hope for. And whether it be also ECOWAS in West Africa, looking to promote free movement of populations in order to support access to different livelihoods. This is a recognition that people will move, not just only because of climate change, but because this is just what people will do, because the sense of urbanization, the changing of livelihoods, accessing different skill sets, that rather than resisting it, they're embracing it. And so we have got an opportunity, rather than trying to push back against a tide which we're not going to succeed with, is to look at what these mega trends are doing, including urbanization, and supporting those leaders. And I was on a panel with the mayor of Freetown last week, who was absolutely brilliant. And so we need to be looking for those champions for looking at a more sustainable, positive future and providing them with the support rather than whinging and complaining all the time that we've got no ideas. People on the front lines have got ideas and want to make a difference. We've got to give them the ammunition and support to do it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yes, Beatrice.
Yes, thank you. Really good question, looking at opportunities and trying to bring some positive light into what sometimes feel a bit as a dark environment, the one in which we live, talking about climate change and its impacts. I think two aspects that I'd like to highlight here. One is what Andrew was also mentioning before in terms of like, we really see, and I'm speaking with my researcher hat here, we're really seeing a big increase in the understanding of the need for and in attempts at conducting integrated research. So really crossing silos to try and understand these complexities better. And if you look at the literature between on climate change and conflict, like 5 to 10 years ago, it was all about trying to prove in a quantitative way whether there's an empirical link between climate change impacts and conflict. And I think now we moved on from whether there is a link to the need to understand how these linkages and these complexities play out. I think Majd's presentation did a great job in highlighting all these complexities in different contexts that we're seeing on the ground. So initiatives like weathering risk that Andrew was mentioning before that really focus on a specific context and try to develop a methodology to understand these risks systematically, and then use this evidence that we build in collaboration between different organizations, because everybody has something to contribute and nobody can be specialized in everything. So collaboration and partnerships are essential here, and then bring in this evidence that we generate to inform policymaking. And then the second side of it is actually the policymaking, and I would say maybe the programming side of it. So the way in which we intervene then to address these risks, maybe speaking a bit more about the development and kind of humanitarian programs and donors. So there we're seeing a big change in terms of understanding the need for integrated programming and the need to kind of work across silos to integrate different responses in different sectors. So if I take, for example, peace building interventions, there's a big move there to work to integrate climate change risks and addressing climate change risks as part of this intervention. The Peace Building Fund is doing some really innovative projects in this area. And you're really seeing on the ground the emergence of evidence of what works and what doesn't work, and maybe in terms of opportunities for the future, even opportunities to do even more so and to collect more of these lessons learned, and using forums like this one to share these lessons learned to improve our practice and the work we're doing on the ground.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beatrice. Who's also been one of the leading trainers on the climate sensitive programming that the Staff College is offering. So I want to give the floor to Majd. Perhaps she also has some reflections on this topic.
Yeah, thank you very much. Adding to what my colleagues has already mentioned, I believe in order to trying to find solution, we need to identify the problem. And today we are here gathered to discuss the linkage between climate change, migration, and conflict. So we are on the right path, let's say like that. But to decrease the climate change effect, I think we need to increase the user's resilience. And in order to do that, at WANA Institute, for example, we are working directly with the CBOs, community-based organization, with individuals, with the end users, the people who are affected much by the climate change, because they are the most vulnerable comparing to the policymaker. When we are working on the field with the grassroots, we sense how eager they are to create a change. We're trying to advocate the nature-based approach, how they can use that in order to decrease and increase their resilience toward climate change by providing them the know-how, the technology, the science beneath climate change, how they can mitigate and adapt towards the effect of this climate change. We can't only focus on the policy maker and the COP26 etc., but also we have to work with the grassroots on the field and increase their capacity building, increase their resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was a question from Dame Yadeta who had raised his hands. I don't know if he's still with us. And he wants to add any comments on this. Okay, maybe not. I see that there was a question that has been tackled by Andrew already. There is a comment. Okay, there's a comment from Pascale Gaborit. Any other questions from the participants from the floor for our speakers? Any other thoughts? Okay, I wonder whether before we do a concluding round, perhaps of remarks, you would like to, the panelists would like to add anything following on the reflections of their fellow panelists. Okay, so I think, oh yes, Beatrice, please.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up to Andrew's response on Bangladesh in the question in the chat. Actually, I agree that Bangladesh is a very interesting country that has taken a lot of really innovative solutions and really looked at these issues of migration, both internal migration, particularly internal migration, I would say, and linked to different impacts of climate change. And in Bangladesh, we say a bit more in the paper. There's a really interesting example also of investments into second-tier cities in order to kind of take the pressure out of large cities like Dhaka and Chittagong in terms of hosting migrants from other parts of the country, largely rural parts of the country, and really investing in what they define as migrant-friendly cities. So looking at how in spatial planning, how in developing the city, because urbanization, like cities are growing, how do we make them grow in such a way that can accommodate people coming in with jobs, with infrastructure and so on. And so again, to the point maybe of opportunities before, there's a lot going on, a lot of really interesting examples that it's important to document and look at because they can offer solutions and the ideas for solutions also in other contexts.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. On the last one, maybe for another round of questions, if there are any. I see the Dame Yadeta came back. If you'd like to ask your questions, please let us know.
Ginevra, if I can also just add one thing to the what is also interesting is just the let's say the questions which states are starting to ask in anticipation of what the impact of climate change will be. And so while Joseph asked about the issue of Bangladesh, on the sidelines of UNGA this week, or actually on the weekend, you had the representative for Vanuatu asking, well, basically stating that that the country was going to approach the International Court of Justice to get advice on what would be the protection provided to residents and future residents who will be impacted by climate change. And so this is a state asking for advice because they won't be refugees because they're not fleeing persecution or discrimination. They won't necessarily be stateless because the territorial integrity of the state does not cease even if it goes underwater. So there's a lot of questions which we need to be looking at now in order to be ready when the situation becomes even more desperate. There were some decisions last year, January last year, by the Human Rights Committee, which looked at the case of a resident from Kiribati who sought refugee status in New Zealand. That was denied by the courts in New Zealand because they said the risk to his life was not imminent, but they said basically come back in 10 years' time and we'll look at it again. So these issues of what will be the international protection requirements for populations increasingly at risk are also going to need to be taken into account. So we've got decisions being made at the national level, like, and that's probably leading a lot of the international protection discussion. We've got regional regimes, whether it be the Kampala Declaration or Cartagena. We've also got international statutes. Obviously, you've got the Refugee Convention, where you may have that nexus between conflict and climate displacement. But there's also many other elements which are coming to the fore and being discussed. And so these issues will continually be brought to the fore as we talk about the need for not so much hard security, but human security. And I think this is one of the key objectives, and it's something which I pushed last year and every security conference. When you talk about security, let's move away from walls and guns, and let's talk about human security and addressing the needs of why people have to move in the first place. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew, for this important contribution. And Pascaline Gaborit, you've raised your hand. Could you please introduce yourself and ask your question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Pascale Gabory. I'm working for NGO Pilots for Dev. I was wondering before, there are these tragic situations of displacements. Do you believe that there can be solutions with early warning systems, prevention, work with weather forecast agencies to avoid more disasters? I mean, what will be the part, in your opinion, of the new technologies in the climate adaptation?
Thank you. Any volunteers?
Okay, I don't want to talk too much, but the amount of data analysis, AI modeling that we have available to us now to look at various scenarios was not available to us 5, 10, 15 years ago. So the technology is like you have the soft technology, like you've got the data and the ability to use that data. One of the biggest challenges is to actually have the data interpreted in a manner that people will implement the required responses in order to prevent or mitigate the impact. So for instance, if you look at the modeling that a number of agencies have been doing, and whether again be Adelphi or whether it be Potsdam, looking at the increase in the temperature in particular regions and then seeing what is the likelihood of crops being able to be sustained at that increased rate. And for instance, like an adaptation may be to start looking at changing the way in which crops are cycled, or the different types of crops that are used. There's also modeling which talks about rainfall and the amount of rain-fed agriculture. Maybe we've already got to start looking at changing that. Maybe we have to, rather than resist or try and mitigate populations moving, if we can already understand that certain areas will be uninhabitable in certain areas, then we should be starting now in order to move those people in a way which is much more structured. So I think what the modeling and what the data is telling us is that there should be no excuses. There should be no surprises to anyone who are working on climate or development or even humanitarian affairs. It's just whether we choose to ignore, which many agencies and leaders continue to do, or whether we grasp these opportunities and make sure that every decision that we make now is in line as much as possible, not only with the data, but with the wishes of the populations on the ground. And again, I've got to probably focus on, I know that I stress a lot on data, but that data can only be of use if it's calibrated with the populations on the ground. Over.
Thank you, and very important. Yes, Majd, please.
Yeah, thank you. I believe technology is a good tool to be used, but it needs to be introduced well to the end user. I'm talking about a very small level. For example, farm level. Farmers will receive notification that tonight will be a frost event. Then he will can take action to decrease this effect on his crops. So indirectly, we're gonna increase his resilience toward that specific event. Just I would like to add something that actions at the state level should be also implemented to decrease the environmental displaced people, especially farmers, as compensation and subsidies in order that they can mitigate well and they can cultivate, for example, drought tolerant seeds, etc. And thank you.
Thank you very much. We've come really to the very end of this panel. There's 1 minute to the end, so I'm sorry for those questions that can't be tackled. I think we've come a long way. We started from really I'm trying to understand what are some of the questions that can be asked, but more so identifying some of the honest answer that we need to give ourselves. We did discuss the issue of the narrative that we're building, and we have enough data and we have enough instruments to really show the causality or not of some of the interrelations between mobility, climate security, and conflicts. So that's why I did prompt the question of are there any opportunities? What is happening to we know the problem. We somehow have some ideas and recommendations as to the way forward. Why are we not doing it, or what is already happening that is leading us to that direction? I know that there is a lot of negativism amongst all of the climate change community, especially after the summer with all the impacts of climate change in our daily lives and the report of that we all read of the IPCC. But as you pointed out, there is something is moving. There's more, regional partnerships that are developing. Also, at the local level, Majd pointed out that there is increasing awareness and eagerness from local communities to participate. And as Beatrice said, there is also a tendency to basically come together and work more and more in an integrated way, which is also what the general agenda is pushing the UN to do. But we would agree that as an international community composed of different parts, local, national, subnational, regional, and international, we all have to work together. So, as Madeleine Albright would say, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. I think in addition to worrying, we need to take action all together and very urgently. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you so much to the speakers for participating in this interesting panel. We will have 2 more coffee hours of the UN System Staff College participating at the Berlin Climate Security Conference tomorrow at 3 p.m. There's one on food security with and climate security. At 3 p.m. with WFP and local civil society organization and FAO. So we hope to see you there. And there will be one more on 4th October discussing the interlinkages between gender and climate security in sustaining peace. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon or evening for those who are in a different time zones than us. Thank you so much. All the best.